Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of What's on My Desk. It is 5 a.m. Seems like I live on a plane sometimes. I travel all the time. Today's trip is actually a short one. I have to meet a client in LA. I got an 8:30 flight, so I have to get out early. What's the reasoning of me flying to LA to meet with one client? Just sort of to touch back on a couple of episodes ago, the vlog that I did about Dubai, where you have FaceTime with your clients. Now, this guy is not any more important than any other client. He's not a celebrity. He's just a regular guy. But he's a guy that's been buying from me since I started this thing out of my basement 15 years ago. And he's not really buying a super expensive watch. I could have FedExed the watch. It would have cost me $20 to get it there. But once again, it's important to sometimes touch base with your clients. If that means getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and leaving the house at 5 a.m. to get on the plane to go across country, and that's what we do. The good part is that while I'm out in LA, I'm going to meet with an old, dear friend of mine, probably the foremost vintage watch expert out there. And since I'm not the foremost expert in vintage pieces, I decided while I'm in LA, I can put someone else on camera who is, and give you guys a little bit of an insight on that market. But for now, I got to get to the airport. Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of What's on My Desk. Technically, it's not what's on my desk, but it's what's on my dear friend Bob Maron's desk. As I mentioned to you earlier, I came out to California to meet with a client tomorrow morning, but I used this opportunity to come visit my old friend Bob, and the reason I did that is because Bob has been a mentor to me since I started in this business 15 some years ago. He told me I was going places, he was right, and I'm very glad that his predictions came true. However, the biggest reason we're here is because Bob, in my eyes and the eyes of a lot of people around the world, is the number one foremost expert when it comes to vintage pieces. And why we're talking about vintage pieces is to sort of rebuttal what I've told you guys in the past, where watches are not an investment but an expensive toy, but there are a few minor exceptions. And if you want to see those exceptions, if you want to see some of the most rare stuff in the world, this is really the place to be. There's no other place in the world that I can think of unless you go to Sotheby's auctions where you can actually get your hands on rare pieces such as this. I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to let Bob tell you why vintage watches today are indeed an investment and show you some of the craziest stuff you guys have ever seen.
The watch manufacturers today are basically remaking the classics of their past, with a few exceptions, and those exceptions are the watches that are selling for them. You know, we could talk about modern watches, certain modern watches, which I would encourage, my clients to buy. The best Pateks made today, the best Rolexes made today, even the best APs made today, are basically remakes of classic watches from the past. And my money would rather buy the early watches that were not manufactured as collectibles versus stuff today that's manufactured collectibles. I think there's a dramatic difference between the two. The difference being, I hope this doesn't come out wrong, the old money has their watches in old watches. The new money tends to put their watches into new, modern collectibles, manufactured collectibles. And when the taste changes from those watches tend to get dumped back on the market. Not all of them, but a good portion of them. And it's the curve of a modern watch looks something like this. The curve of a vintage watch looks something like this, because vintage watches were made at a time where a lot more care and craft and thought went into the watches. They were not made in great quantities, and they're not making any more of them. So there's always going to be new collectors, new clients that appreciate the past, the originals, and as a result, the demand is going to increase while the supply won't. Look, Ford comes out with a new Shelby, which is a great car. And I think it's a car that went off the shelf at I'd say $30,000 to $40,000, and today they're worth 50 grand. But a vintage Shelby, a Shelby from '68 that was sold for $8,000 new, $12,000 fully loaded, is a $350,000 car today, and it's only going to get more expensive.
And good luck buying one too.
Yeah, right, and good luck finding one, and finding one in good condition. And there have now been 4 more iterations of modern Shelbys. And I'm a fan of them. I love them. But I don't love them as much, and I don't collect them in the way that I collect the vintage original Shelbys. And the same thing can be said for art, cars, and more than any other collectible can be said for watches. A watch that comes to mind is the Rolex Gmt.
I talked about that in one of my last episodes where I showed a vintage Pepsi versus a new one that trades as double its value, which is, to me, pretty ridiculous. But I still find the appeal in the older stuff. But there's different levels to this stuff. So, like, show me a few. I know you bought a couple.
For example, okay, there's the original. That's 1959. It's a Bakelite. It's perfect. It's got a beautiful Bakelite bezel. It has an amazing dial. The watch is unpolished. That's a watch that trades for, let's say, $90,000 to $150,000. They've sold for as much as $300,000 at auction.
Wow.
Look, I'm doing this 35 years. I remember when that was a $12,000 watch. But for a very long period of time, that was a watch that was $40,000 to $50,000. There's a new appreciation in GMTs. GMTs are probably, you might say they're the new Daytonas. I can't think of a watch, a specific model of Rolex that's appreciated in the same trajectory as GMT. There's a 1675. So that's the next watch that came out after the Bakelite bezels. And those watches were $4,000 5 years ago. $5,000, let's say. Today they're $18,000 to $25,000.
Let's see, personally, again, I like the appeal of vintage watches. Guys know that I collect vintage Rolexes as well. And to me, this is very, very appealing, especially when there's a story behind it and you really know what you're looking at. Because at a glance, they all look alike, but...
For me, the most interesting thing about this watch is as follows. The watch was made for pilots in 1959. This regular version came out in 1960 and was made till 1980. That 20 years was a 20-year period with a tremendous interest and advancement and technological advancements of the aeronautics industry. So that watch iconically represents an era, not just America, all over the world. There's no watch that better represents, I would say, the 70s and 80s. That watch has been reintroduced and sells for $18,000 on the street, brand new. Why would you spend $18,000 for a brand new watch, manufactured as a collectible, pay double retail, when you can buy one? That particular model's from 1972. When you can buy one that's 36 years old, looks just as good, and is certainly being made in fewer numbers.
Tell me about this Blueberry.
So this is an interesting watch. A Blueberry bezel was a watch that the market didn't even understand for so many years. If I go back 10 years, people didn't even understand them. No one knew if they were real. Nobody knew what they were. We had seen all black bezels. We had seen black and red bezels, and we'd see black and blue bezels. The Coke, the Pepsi, and the Blackberry. But we never saw a Blueberry. Then they started being traded as novelties. Now that they've been accepted, that they're serviced at Rolex, and that everybody knows that they're original and were made in very small numbers, these are $50,000 watches.
That's crazy.
And great investments.
And original retail value was what, $200?
That watch was sold retail for $960, I believe.
Okay, so since we're on the topic of buying new manufactured collectors, one of the biggest hypes out there today for modern watches, for me, what I get most requests on is your plain Royal Oaks. Now, I know Royal Oaks are near dear. Actually, Jarrell Genta is near dear to your heart, who invented or who designed the Royal Oak. And now, from what I understand, there's a huge emerging market. And again, it goes with what you said. Why would you pay $5,000, $10,000 over retail on a modern watch when you can pick up an original Genta such as this? Now, how old is this watch?
Okay, so this is not a first series or an A series. Well, I can show you an A series, but this is a C.
Sure. He's got a few.
So the A's came out in 72, the B's came out in 74, the C's came out in 77. So here's a 1977 Audemars Piguet steel Royal Oak. This is a watch that you're going to pay $25,000 to $30,000 for. you're going to pay that kind of money to buy a brand new one that is being manufactured as a collectible. That is a true piece of art. It represents an era where, well, first of all, it was designed by Jarrell Genta's hand. And it's the most comfortable watch in the world to wear. And I have to tell you, Roman, when you look at these Royal Oaks, personally, I don't think I've ever put a watch on my wrist that's more I could sleep in this watch.
You don't have to sell me. It's my number one
You know
favorite
that
brand. You don't have to sell me.
there's nothing more comfortable. And when you look at
Agreed.
vintage APs, why wouldn't anybody have one? These watches have quadrupled in the last 5 years.
Now, since we're talking about Jarrell Genta, I'm going to pick up these two watches.
Extreme example.
This is an extreme example of Jarrell Genta. Now, this is something, I actually sold one of these. I sold the one that was made for the Prince of Brunei. Mm-hmm. When I first started out, I think I sold one back then for about $400,000. Originally, this was, what, $1.6 million? This is the Grand Complications. This is sort of like the Sky Moon Tourbillon from Patek.
Yeah, you've got two different models. This one here, you can see that it has Prince Geoffrey's, again, the Prince of Brunei's logo on the dial, also on the back of the clasp. And this is a tourbillon, grand and petite sonnerie. In other words, it's a clock watch, minute repeater, perpetual calendar with retrograde hours. This is a very complicated watch. It's made in palladium. No watches were made in palladium at the time. And the rotor's signed by Jarrell Genta. That's a watch that retailed for $1.4 million and can be bought for a fraction of the price today. It's also a true Jarrell Genta, an incredibly complicated watch. And
would you say this watch is more complex than, let's say, a Sky Moon Tourbillon? In the same echelon?
It's in the same echelon, along with any of the most complicated of the Vacherons. This is one of the last watches that Jarrell Genta made, signed by Jarrell Genta. This is a perpetual calendar, grand and petite sonnerie, double power reserve, retrograde, tourbillon, minute repeater. The back is spectacular. If you just take a look at the engraving.
The machine in here is, this is just something else.
You know, I was from the era of Philippe Stern, before Thierry Stern and Patek Philippe. And the only watch that Philippe Stern ever stopped me to ask me about, because I would see him at Basel, was this. I had one of these on 10 years ago. Most of them were made for the Sultan of Brunei. And he actually stopped me and said, I haven't had one of those in my hand. Do you mind if I take a look at it? And he also was just marveled by it. It's an amazing watch.
Since we're talking about Patek Philippe, I know I personally sold this watch, which is a 5071 or 5070 chronograph Patek, but with diamonds. Now, I personally sold one of these watches a few years back for around $200,000.
Today it's $450, and I pulled it off for that reason.
I feel like a complete idiot because it wasn't that long ago that this watch was $200. I think I sold it for $225, and today this thing is $450,000. So there are pieces out there that are an investment. Why is this an investment? I can answer that question myself. How many do you think of these they made? Now, anybody that tells you they know how many Pateks were made, unless it's a limited edition, is lying to you. Nobody knows how many of those things are made. Only Patek knows that. Well, maybe Bob knows too, but
I do.
Of course you do. So how many did they make of these?
20.
They make 20 of these.
They made 20, 50, 70.
And this is not...
They made a run of 10, and they made a further run of 10.
Now, this is not official information. Bob just happens to be in this world for a long time, so he happens to have, let's call it, connection, so he knows. But it's really not public knowledge. But pieces like this, you come to a guy like Bob and say, look, I want an investment watch. I'm going to spend a couple of $100,000 to put away. If he would have, whoever he put into one of these a couple of years back at $200,000 is a very happy camper today, and that's why they keep coming back to him, buying stuff, selling stuff, and so on and so forth. And speaking of crazy Pateks, what's this, Bob?
So this is a 5020. I brought it up for two reasons. First of all, it's commonly known as a TV watch. I want you to know. TV. Yeah. Okay. So it's a 3970.
Yeah.
It's a 3970 movement in a square case. It did not work for Patek. I can tell you that in 1996. I wanted to buy a platinum 3970 from Jan Bronson in Beverly Hills, and he would not sell it to me unless I bought a platinum one of these for $52,000. And I had a hard time selling it. A platinum 5020 today, a watch that was impossible to sell, is $400,000 to $500,000 today. This one, of course, is more because it has a unique dial with painted enamel.
So what does that trade for?
Upwards of $600,000. And it's the only one known. It's It's a piece unique. I just got the extract on it.
It's funny you should say that. So it's I talked to somebody about this before. We talked about things, quote unquote, rejects, and rejects are usually those models that are not successful for a company some time ago, which means they don't end up making a lot of them. The first thing that comes to mind when I started collecting vintage Rolex, I think you told me about a 168000, the sub that was made in surgical steel.
Yeah.
Those things were only made for how long?
1 year.
1 year, because they were not a hit. Something about using surgical steel, people didn't really care for it. Nobody really cared.
It was difficult to use, expensive, in the public.
Exactly. So now fast forward, back then those things were $3,000-$4,000. Fast forward to today, if you want to pick one of those up complete with box and papers, what are you paying?
Well, I don't know about box and papers, but I just paid $10,500 for one naked. I think box and papers would sell.
Now, mind you, Bob paid $10,500, and I told you guys we work anywhere from 5 to 10% profit margin, sometimes 20, depending on how rare something is. So you can do the math. We're talking about 3 times fold just over the last few years.
Right.
I also obviously saved the best for last. This is probably the heavy hitters, and this is probably what you want in your collection if you want to collect Rolexes, and these are your Paul Newman Daytonas. I've told you guys before, the Daytona is the #1 collected watch. The Daytona is the one watch that always sells over list right out of the gate. It's probably the #1 selling watch period as far as I'm concerned, but I've never showed you guys stuff like this.
It's the Dow Jones of our industry. It created our industry. It created collectible watches.
Tell me about these two.
Steel Daytonas are very dear to my heart. I started selling them in 1984. They were $500 each.
I was 9 years old, by the way.
I wasn't. It was a watch that, you can buy them for $500. There was an arbitrage. You can actually buy one in the Midwest for $500, take it out to the West Coast and sell it for $1,000. By '89, that started closing up. They were about $3,000 nationwide. And by the time the internet broke in '96, eBay came on the picture. These watches were $10,000, $11,000. Paul Newman's were $12,000 to $16,000. Today, a simple steel Daytona like this, which went from $500 to $3,000. When it hit $9,000, everybody told us it was over. I have been predicting that it would hit $100,000 for the last 30 years. This particular example is $90,000 today, but a simple one that didn't have some of the features that this one has, like the floating small Daytona, etc. But just a simple, let's say the least expensive one would still cost you $60,000. And a Paul Newman, this is $250,000, which is a good value from somebody. I never thought I'd say that.
Dial, it's funny about these things. The dial alone, what's the dial alone worth if you just wanted to buy the dial? Because I know there's an actual market for these dials because it's just so rare.
Let's just say, generally speaking, give or take, based on condition, a steel Paul Newman dial today is $150,000.
That's nuts, guys.
Yeah. Well,
now imagine if you're one of those guys that bought 10 of these at $3,000 back in the day.
The one thing I can tell you, Roman, everybody wants one. It's the absolute classic design of a watch, and I think that every watch that came after it pulls some DNA from it.
Now let's talk about the gold piece in my hand now.
Well, these are probably the biggest surprise for anybody because the gold watches traditionally sold for just a tad more than the steel watches. Let's just say when a steel one was $12,000, these were $16,000, $18,000, even $20,000. And Paul Newman, gold Paul Newmans were at really the height, 2006, 2007, this is a $150,000 watch. And today it's $1 million watch. And I can tell you all the steps that brought it there. But the bottom line is, it's one of the most beautiful, most desirable, and most collectible watches in the world. And it's going to $2 million.
You know the best part about that $1 million watch? You put that on your wrist, 99 out of 100 people will never know you have $1 million on your wrist.
But you will.
And then last but not least, I was in Bob's vault earlier, and I looked at this thing, and I'm like, Bob, what is this? And I'm being dead honest.
And it's the last watch I would have ever have shown you. You picked it out.
Now, and I looked at this thing, and I said, okay, so it looks like it's an annual calendar from Rolex. I know that generally, and is this a bubble back case? Am I right?
Well,
sort of.
Yeah, but it's the least interesting thing about the watch. The bottom line is, Rolex, feeling the heat from Patek Philippe, who had just started to market important watches as far as complications, Rolex felt threatened, and they came out and only made them for about 5 years, 3 models. They made, we call this a waterproof. It's a 6062, which is a triple date moon phase. Then they came out with a Pataloni, a larger triple date moon phase, not waterproof, snapback. And they also came out with the John Claude Keeley, which is a triple date chronograph. And these watches were around from 1948 to 1953, give or take a year. There weren't a lot of them sold, and this is probably the most desirable of the three complications.
Before you get into the price, drum roll please. Last auction result on this timepiece?
A little over $5 million.
Now, ask yourself, guys, does this look like $5 million to you? Honestly, if somebody brought this to my shop, I mean, I know what it is, but 10 years ago, somebody brought this to my shop, I'd be hard pressed to give him $5,000 for something like this. So knowledge is king. So if you're out there and you have one of these and you don't know what it is, you have a $5 million watch. That's how nuts the collectible market can
Black
get.
star dials are almost unheard of. There's a lot of yellow gold star dials with white dials. There's even rose gold star dials with white gold. And by the way, rose golds have gone from 200,000 to 2 million. Yellow golds with white dials have gone from 100,000 to 600,000. And I'm talking about in the last 4 or 5 years. But there's only 5 black dial stars.
Guys, there's
now.
also another very special vintage Rolex that you guys don't see on Bob's desk, not my desk right now, and I'm going to show you that Rolex. And this is a very sentimental watch, and the reason it is, it's actually on my wrist. And this is a single red Submariner in an absolute excellent condition with box and papers, tags, and everything else. And what makes this watch so special is that about 13 years ago, this was the very first vintage Rolex that I ever bought, and I got it from the gentleman sitting to my right.
I want to buy it back.
He sold it to me, I think, for $8,000. Today it's what, 28?
I'll give you 30.
See, so
it's got box and papers, and it's a good
have
watch.
it, guys. There's a lot of exceptions to the rule when it comes to watches, and there are quite a lot of watches out there that are indeed an investment, but there are very, very few. It's a very small percentage to that of the modern world out there today. The question you're going to ask is, well, what the hell do I know about this if I want to invest into stuff like this? Well, you have to find a reputable dealer. And how do you define a reputable? Well, you can take my recommendation in regards to Bob. You can contact me and we can get you whatever you want. However, the idea is finding somebody that knows what they're talking about. If you notice, as we're talking about this watches, I didn't know half the stuff that's on this table. I couldn't tell a $200,000 Daytona from a $250,000 Daytona, or $1 million Daytona for that matter. But if you find somebody that knows their shit, as they say, someone like Bob, you come to him and say, this is what I'm looking to do. And he'll ask you, he's not going to try to sell you something. He'll ask you, like, what is your goal? What are you trying to do? Are you in it for the appeal? Do you want to have the hottest, the latest, and the greatest in the vintage world? You want to be the only guy in the room in the entire world? And there's a watch for you. Keep in mind, you are paying a premium when you're buying vintage. But Bob makes a great point. Why go out and spend the same amount of money on a manufactured collectible, which indeed will be a collectible down the line 20, 30 years from now, when you can, for the same money, a little more, pick up a collectible back that's already dated back 30 years. And this is really the point of this entire conversation. If you guys already don't know Bob, I'm going to link his website below. You guys can contact him, email his office, and he'll gladly answer all your questions. Or if you're in California, you can always stop by his showroom. But this has been great, Bob. I mean, honestly,
I appreciate it.
I didn't expect to see $5 million in vintage pieces on your desk. I learned something new today just the same, and I'm probably going to walk out of here with another watch. I'm fairly certain, because this guy is actually a better salesman than me. He'll end up selling me a watch before I get out of here. 100%. Bob, thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
It was a pleasure.
Can I add one thing, Roman, to what you said?
Please, in closing.
The best advice I can give, to people interested in watches as investments, as collectibles, to get the most joy out of a watch, is, and I say this after many years of doing this business, it's not just finding the right dealer and finding somebody that can show you why a subtle difference makes a huge difference. But I find, more often than not, that my customers, in the long run, often know more than me, because they buy what they like. And it's the same thing with art, it's the same thing with cars. If you simply look and listen to your dealer, but buy what you truly like, what moves you emotionally, trust me, you'll get the last laugh. Because when people buy from their heart, using their emotion, what they love, guaranteed, that's the next thing that's shooting up.
So guys, I guess what I'm going to tell you is that the two pieces I would pick off this tray, and I would do this really, really quickly, and I've been actually looking for a really nice bakelite, and I'm an idiot. I missed out on one of these, so it's about $40,000 cheap. I thought it was expensive back then. And I'm certainly right now in my own safe. I have a few Genta Royal Oaks, and anytime I come across one, I just kind of stick them in the back of my safe and I forget about them. These would probably be the two pieces I would literally take off Bob's desk today if I had to wear one.
Let's finish this so I can start selling.
All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you, Robert.
Again, thank you, Bob. I'll link all of his information below. Check him out. Anything, when it comes to anything vintage, when I'm offered anything vintage, the first WhatsApp I send out is to Bob and say, Bob, what is this? How much is this? What do we do? I'll see you guys next week. So, had a great time yesterday with hanging out with Bob. Checked out some really cool watches that I showed you earlier. The point of this trip was, again, 24 hours in and out, go visit a client. And as I mentioned earlier, he's not an important client because he spent a lot of money. He's an important client because he's been with me for many years. I'm meeting my guy in about 40 minutes. I'm gonna go grab a cup of coffee and head out and meet him. It's these little things that makes myself and my company stand out with customers that have been with us for 10 or 15 years. And again, even though you get to see him maybe once a year, maybe once every 5 years, it's still always a pleasure to sit down one-on-one with someone that's you've been doing business with for a long time, regardless of how much money they spend or what their average buying price is. So I am not going to show you my meeting with the client because client privacy to me is extremely important. I never share any client information. Although some clients have already asked me to come out and like maybe tape stuff about their collection. In that case, I will do that. The reason I did the quote-unquote what's on my desk with Bobby is I think I'm going to start a new playlist. I'm going to call it collabs or collaborations or however you call it nowadays, where I'm going to collab with various people in the industry as well as private clients that want to get on camera and do this with me and talk about watches and get different perspectives. I may not always be right. You may often disagree with what I have to say, but hey, this is what this platform is about. So for now, I'm going to go grab a cup of coffee, head out and meet my clients. So, my meeting with my guy went really, really well. It was a pleasure to see him. He loved the watch. It was good to sit down and just shoot the shit, for about an hour and, tell him where my business has gone since we first met versus where it is today. I think the first time this guy bought something from me, I was still working out of my basement part-time, trying to peddle a few watches on eBay versus where we are today. It's a hell of a contrast now. Of course, my guy was somewhat aware of where we've gone from the first time we met, but it was nice to sort of give him those details in person and hear some praises back. It's always a pleasure. And nice to catch up with what's going on in his life. Now it's, I guess it's about 12 o'clock. My plane is at 2:30. I'm gonna pack up my stuff and get out of here. It's been fun, LA. Let's get to the airport.
Philadelphia. The local time is 10:02, which means you do not.
So, 30 hours later, I'm back in not so sunny Philadelphia. Got to meet my client. You guys got to meet Robert Maron and see $5 million worth of vintage watches. So it's a win-win. Now about an hour ride home. I'm exhausted, so I'm gonna try to get some sleep. Get to the office early tomorrow, finish up some stuff. That's the end of the vlog.